In 2026, India crossed into the fourth largest economy on Earth. Not projected, not forecasted as a distant possibility. Confirmed by IMF nominal GDP data at approximately $4.3 trillion. A nation that Western institutional frameworks still classify through the lens of a developing world taxonomy now sits ahead of Japan, ahead of the United Kingdom, ahead of France, and is closing in on Germany. The speed of that ascent is not what stopped boardrooms in Washington, Brussels, and Tokyo cold, though. What stopped them was the realization that the GDP number is almost beside the point, because the most consequential story about India in the 21st century is not told in a spreadsheet, it is told on water. Specifically, 3.8 million square miles of it. The Indian Ocean, the single most strategically critical body of water on this planet, and the only ocean that carries a nation's name. That is not a cartographic accident. That is not a colonial-era naming convention that history has rendered quaint. That is a declaration written in geography that the rest of the world is only now beginning to read correctly. This report is going to take you through the full architecture of why that ocean belongs to India, not in some abstract symbolic sense, but in the hard, structural sense of trade corridors, naval positioning, demographic gravity, and monetary leverage. We are going to trace the historical logic, stress test the current data, examine the challenges with intellectual honesty, and arrive at a conclusion that the mainstream commentary orbit has consistently failed to articulate with sufficient clarity. India is not rising toward a seat at the global table. India is in the process of becoming the table. Let us start where every serious geopolitical analysis must start, with geography, because geography is the one variable that no policy document, no alliance framework, and no amount of infrastructure spending can manufacture from scratch. The Indian Ocean carries approximately 80% of the world's seaborne oil trade. Every barrel of crude that moves from the Persian Gulf to the industrial economies of East Asia, every liquefied natural gas shipment heading from Qatar to Japan, every container vessel carrying electronics from Shenzhen to Rotterdam, transits routes that cut directly through Indian Ocean waters. The ocean connects the Persian Gulf's hydrocarbon reserves to Asian manufacturing corridors, links East Africa's emerging resource economies to South Asian consumption markets, and serves as the primary highway between the world's most dynamic growth regions. Approximately 100,000 vessels move through it on any given day. It is not a maritime route. It is the respiratory system of the global economy. And at the geographic center of that respiratory system, with a coastline stretching over 7,500 kilometers, with an exclusive economic zone encompassing 2.37 million square kilometers, and with the Andaman and Nicobar Islands sitting roughly 90 miles from the Strait of Malacca, the most important maritime choke point on Earth, sits India. Not adjacent to the action, not a regional player with peripheral access, at the center. This is the foundational fact from which every other element of this analysis flows. But geography alone has never made a superpower. History is littered with well-positioned nations that failed to convert positional advantage into structural power. What makes the current moment different, what makes 2026 the inflection point rather than 2006 or 1986, is that India's economic mass has now crossed what serious strategists call the activation threshold. The geography was always present. The economic weight to leverage it is now arriving. To understand why this matters so much, and why the ocean was always India's by structural logic even during the centuries when European powers dominated it, you have to go back considerably further than most analysts bother to look. Before Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498, before the Portuguese mapped these waters and inserted themselves into its commerce, the Indian Ocean was already a sophisticated, functioning global trade system. The Chola Empire, operating from the 9th to the 13th century out of what is now South India, was the Eastern Hemisphere's first credible blue water power. Their naval architecture was advanced enough that modern maritime historians classify them as projecting genuine oceanic power, not merely coastal defense capability. Chola merchant networks stretched across Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives, operating what amounted to a maritime state whose commercial reach was greater than that of most European kingdoms of the same era. Indian merchants controlled spice routes, textile corridors, and gold trade long before European ships entered these waters. When da Gama arrived on the Malabar coast, he did not discover a primitive shoreline awaiting development. He arrived at a functioning global trade hub with centuries of institutional infrastructure. The British East India Company, when it eventually consolidated control across the subcontinent, did not build Indian Ocean commerce. It captured a system that already existed and redirected the value flows toward London. For 2 centuries, the colonial architecture systematically extracted wealth from this ocean theater to European capitals, and in doing so, it suppressed the natural strategic weight of the subcontinent. What colonialism could not alter, however, was the geometry. The coastline remained, the islands remained, the choke point proximity remained. The structural conditions for Indian Ocean dominance were never eliminated. They were simply held in suspension, waiting for the economic mass required to activate them. That activation is now underway, and the numbers document it with a clarity that leaves little room for interpretive wiggle. If you value data-driven analysis over mainstream narratives, and you are watching this because you want to understand the global shift before it becomes consensus, subscribe to this channel right now. This is the kind of structural analysis that takes hours to build and seconds to miss. Stay with it. India's economy in 2026 is the fourth largest by nominal GDP at approximately $4.3 trillion, and the third largest by purchasing power parity, the metric that measures real economic weight rather than exchange rate adjusted headline figures. By PPP, India sits ahead of Japan and Germany, behind only the United States and China. The IMF projects India surpasses Japan permanently in nominal terms this year, and the trajectory toward third-place nominal GDP status is no longer a projection for the distant future. It is a mathematical matter of sustained growth rates running at roughly 6.4% annually against competitors growing at 1 to 2%. The compounding is merciless and mechanical. But what makes India's current economic story genuinely different from the standard emerging market narrative is the architecture of the growth itself. Most large economy expansions in history have been built on a single dominant mechanism. China's extraordinary 2003 to 2013 surge was constructed almost entirely on low-cost export manufacturing, fueled by state credit allocation and a labor cost advantage that suppressed wages in service of scale. India is doing something structurally more complex and, in the long run, more durable. It is building on 3 simultaneous pillars that reinforce each other in ways that create compounding returns. The first pillar is the digital infrastructure leapfrog. In 2025, India's unified payments interface processed 228 billion transactions worth approximately $3.4 trillion in annual value. To put that in context, UPI now accounts for roughly 50% of the world's real-time digital payment transaction volume. The IMF formally recognized it in 2025 as the world's largest retail fast payment system by transaction volume. It has surpassed Visa in daily transaction count. This is not an incremental upgrade to an existing financial system. India did not modernize its analog banking infrastructure. It bypassed it entirely, constructing a digital payment architecture that has now become the global benchmark, with over 30 countries in active discussions to adopt variants of the model. The second-order implications of that are profound. Financial inclusion at a scale that integrates hundreds of millions of previously informal economic participants into the trackable, taxable, credit-accessible formal economy, which in turn accelerates consumption growth, tax revenue, and investment returns simultaneously. The second pillar is the manufacturing corridor activation. The production-linked incentive scheme has catalyzed a fundamental restructuring of global supply chains in India's direction. Apple, which manufactured essentially nothing in India as recently as 2017, now produces approximately 14% of its global iPhone output on Indian soil. Samsung, Foxconn, Micron, and thousands of other global manufacturers have either entered the Indian market or substantially expanded their footprint. This is not opportunistic corporate positioning, it is a structural response to the calculated risk of single-country supply chain concentration in China, combined with the genuine cost and scale competitiveness that India's manufacturing ecosystem has developed. The companies making these decisions are not doing so for ideological reasons. They are doing so because the numbers work. The third pillar is the one that no competitor can replicate, manufacture, or accelerate on a policy timeline: the demographic dividend. India's median age in 2026 is 28 years. China's is 39. Germany's is 46. Japan's is 49. India will add approximately 200 million workers to its labor force over the next 2 decades, at the precise moment that every other major economy faces either demographic contraction or stagnation. When you combine a 200 million person labor force expansion with a digital infrastructure that already integrates those workers into a formal economy and a manufacturing base actively seeking to absorb them, you get a self-reinforcing growth loop that has no structural ceiling for at least a generation. Now connect those three pillars to the Indian Ocean, and the strategic picture snaps into focus. An economy of this size and trajectory requires maritime infrastructure to match. It requires sea lanes secured, choke points accessible, and naval architecture commensurate with the trade flows it needs to protect and project. India has been building toward exactly that, and the doctrine articulating the vision was made explicit by Prime Minister Modi in 2015 under the name SAGAR, Security and Growth for All in the Region. This was not diplomatic language. It was India formally declaring its strategic intent over the Indian Ocean domain, and the operational architecture that has been built around it over the subsequent decade is the physical manifestation of that declaration. India now maintains active naval presence and strategic partnership agreements across a network of positions that defense analysts describe as the diamond necklace counter-architecture. To the west, an access agreement with Oman's Duqm port provides India with logistics reach into the Arabian Sea and Gulf of Aden. To the east, the Quad framework with the United States, Australia, and Japan delivers coordinated maritime domain awareness across the Indo-Pacific. In the central Indian Ocean, Indian surveillance assets cover 3.5 million square kilometers from the Seychelles. The Andaman and Nicobar Command, India's only tri-service joint command, has undergone systematic upgrading with long-range maritime patrol aircraft, nuclear-capable submarine deployments, and airfield infrastructure capable of hosting strategic assets. The INS Vikrant, India's domestically built aircraft carrier, represents the clearest symbolic and operational statement of where India's naval ambitions are pointed. What makes this positioning so consequential is not the military hardware alone. The Indian Ocean hosts 6 critical choke points: the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Lombok Strait, the Mozambique Channel, and the Palk Strait. Every single one of these either borders Indian territory, falls within Indian naval range, or sits within a maritime corridor where India has established strategic partnership agreements. That geometry is not coincidental, and it is not merely a military asset. It is an economic leverage instrument of the first order. When a nation controls or can meaningfully influence the security environment of the world's primary oil transit routes, it gains what effectively amounts to implicit veto power over the energy economics of every major industrial nation. That is a form of structural power that no amount of GDP growth alone can purchase. To understand why this is a genuine turning point rather than an incremental development, you have to look at the data point that most analysts underweighted in the previous decade. China understood the strategic importance of Indian Ocean access long before most Western capitals gave it serious attention. Beginning in the early 2000s, Beijing executed what strategists called the String of Pearls doctrine, a systematic acquisition of port infrastructure, commercial facilities, and dual-use installations stretching from Hainan Island through Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan to Djibouti on the Horn of Africa. The logic was explicit to anyone reading the operational architecture carefully. China was constructing a logistical and naval corridor that would allow it to project power into the Indian Ocean without depending on the Strait of Malacca, a vulnerability that Chinese strategists themselves identified and named as the Malacca Dilemma. Gwadar Port in Pakistan, the crown jewel of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, was designed to provide a direct Arabian Sea outlet bypassing 12,000 kilometers of ocean transit. Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka, acquired on a 99-year lease after Sri Lanka defaulted on Chinese debt, was positioned as a potential resupply hub at the heart of the ocean. Here is what the subsequent decade actually produced. Hambantota has substantially underperformed as a commercial asset, and its strategic utility has been constrained by Indian diplomatic pressure and Sri Lanka's own recalibration toward New Delhi. Gwadar faces persistent security challenges, deep-rooted local resistance, and the complicating factor of Pakistan's macroeconomic deterioration, which has fundamentally destabilized the financing assumptions underpinning the entire CPEC framework. The Maldives, which briefly tilted toward Beijing, has moderated its posture as economic realities reasserted themselves. Across Bangladesh, Nepal, and Myanmar, the Chinese infrastructure narrative is competing directly with Indian connectivity offers under the BIMSTEC framework and India's Act East policy, and the terms India is offering are structurally more aligned with recipient country sovereignty concerns. The macro-structural conclusion from this pattern is important and precise. China's String of Pearls was a first-mover advantage strategy executed during a window when India lacked the economic mass to respond in kind. That window has closed. China is projecting power into an ocean that borders India's coastline. India is not operating in a distant theater. It is operating in its natural strategic depth. The home field advantage in geopolitics is not a metaphor. It translates directly into logistical cost, political credibility, cultural alignment, and the simple fact that neighboring nations calculate their long-term interests with their largest and closest neighbor in mind. Nothing illustrates the scale of the strategic recalculation underway more clearly than the behavior of the established powers. The United States government's Indo-Pacific strategy updates between 2022 and 2025 use the phrase Indian Ocean with dramatically increasing frequency across each successive document. More revealing than the word count is the substance. The U.S. has accepted India's doctrine of strategic autonomy, India's explicit and publicly stated refusal to enter formal military alliances as a non-negotiable structural condition of the partnership. Consider what that concession means. The United States constructed its entire post-World War II international order on formal treaty alliances, NATO, ANZUS, the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, the U.S.-South Korea Mutual Defense Treaty. Every major strategic partnership Washington built in the 20th century required formal treaty obligations and explicit alignment with American foreign policy preferences. India said clearly and without ambiguity, "We will not sign that framework." Washington said, "We accept your terms." That is not the diplomatic posture of a superpower dealing with a subordinate partner. That is the posture of a superpower dealing with an indispensable peer whose geography and mass cannot be worked around. The Quad itself, comprising the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, is the most consequential new multilateral security architecture constructed since NATO, but its internal power dynamics are unlike anything in the 20th century alliance template. In NATO, the United States is the anchor power, and every other member orbits Washington's strategic preferences. In the Quad, India is the geographic pivot. Without India, the Quad has no legitimate operational credibility in the Indian Ocean region. Without India, the architecture cannot provide the strategic depth required to create a meaningful counterweight to Chinese maritime expansion. Both Washington and Canberra understand this, and it shapes every negotiation within the framework. Europe, meanwhile, is undergoing its own realignment. France, Germany, and the Netherlands each released formal Indo-Pacific strategies in the early 2020s, the first time major European powers had articulated strategic doctrines for an ocean at such geographic remove from their immediate security environment. France, which maintains the overseas territories of Reunion and the French Southern Territories in the Indian Ocean, has explicitly framed India as its natural partner for regional maritime governance. The European Union's Global Gateway Initiative, a €300 billion infrastructure investment framework positioned explicitly as an alternative to Chinese Belt and Road financing, has identified Indian Ocean connectivity corridors as a primary strategic theater. Europe is not doing this out of sentiment. It is doing it because its own energy security, supply chain resilience, and trade route access are all functions of who governs the Indian Ocean security environment. And the answer to that question, increasingly, points toward New Delhi. The second-order effects of this structural shift are where the real transformation is concentrated, and they are largely invisible to analysts who are still measuring the old variables. Consider what is happening to the Indian rupee. India is currently negotiating bilateral trade settlement arrangements in rupees with a significant number of countries, including the UAE, Russia, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and multiple African Union member states. The Reserve Bank of India has established Rupee Vostro accounts with foreign central banks, allowing them to hold rupees for trade settlement purposes. The implications for the petrodollar architecture, the arrangement by which global oil has been priced and settled in US dollars since the 1970s, and which has been the foundational mechanism of American financial hegemony, are significant. India is in active documented discussions with Gulf Cooperation Council members regarding partial rupee settlement of oil contracts. This is not a geopolitical fantasy, it is a live negotiation. When and if that threshold is crossed, the structural consequences for dollar dominance in the Indian Ocean energy corridor will be felt across the entire global monetary system. Consider what happened at the G20 summit in New Delhi in 2023, when India held the chair. The United States, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, India, Jordan, Israel, and the European Union announced the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, known as IMEC, a multimodal connectivity infrastructure spanning shipping lanes, rail networks, and digital cable systems connecting Mumbai to Haifa to Rotterdam. India was not reacting to someone else's Belt and Road initiative. India was not seeking admission into a framework designed by others. India was convening the major powers and co-designing the alternative. The IMEC corridor, when fully operational, is projected to reduce shipping time between India and Europe by approximately 40% compared to the traditional Suez Canal routing. It will create new investment gravity across the Arabian Peninsula, Eastern Mediterranean, and Indian subcontinent. And it will be governed by a framework in which India holds co-anchor status alongside the United States. That is what macroeconomic dominance looks like in its structural form, not just growing within the existing system, but architecting the next one. Then there is Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa's population will reach 2.5 billion by 2050, representing over a quarter of humanity, and its endowment of critical minerals, cobalt, lithium, manganese, and titanium is essential to the global clean energy transition that every major economy has committed to. The entire eastern seaboard of Africa, from Djibouti to Mozambique, faces the Indian Ocean. India holds structural advantages in this theater that neither China nor any Western power can easily replicate. The Indian diaspora in East Africa numbers over 3 million people, with business networks spanning Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and South Africa that predate independence. India's development cooperation model focuses on capacity building and technology transfer rather than debt-financed infrastructure with governance conditions attached, and African policymakers are increasingly explicit about preferring that approach. And then there is the simple, irreducible fact of distance. Mumbai to Mombasa is 4,400 kilometers. New York to Mombasa is 12,700. Beijing to Mombasa is 11,800. Geography does not negotiate and it does not change. The nation geographically closest to Africa's eastern growth corridor, with the deepest institutional relationships and the fastest growing major economy, is India. Serious analysis demands that we also account for the structural challenges, because intellectual honesty is not optional in this discipline. India's logistics costs as a percentage of GDP remain elevated, roughly 13 to 14%, compared to 8% in China and 6% in advanced economies. That gap functions as a competitiveness tax on every manufactured good India tries to export, and closing it requires infrastructure transformation that operates on decade-scale timelines. The government's Gati Shakti National Master Plan represents a serious, large-scale commitment to that transformation, but commitment and execution are not the same thing, and the variable that matters most is execution consistency at the state level, which remains uneven. India also faces the challenge of skill formation at the scale its demographic dividend demands. Adding 200 million workers to a labor force generates enormous economic potential, but only if those workers can be productively absorbed. That requires not just job creation, but the educational and vocational infrastructure to make those jobs technically accessible, and the current capacity in that area, while improving, has not reached the scale the opportunity requires. Regulatory complexity at the state level remains a friction point for foreign direct investment, and the transmission of federal reform intent into state-level execution is not a problem that any single policy initiative has fully solved. These are not fatal constraints. They are real variables in the outcome function. The difference between India realizing its full structural potential and realizing most of it will be determined by institutional execution quality over the next decade, and that is an honest assessment rather than a hedge. What cannot be hedged, however, is the structural logic that drives the conclusion. The Indian Ocean is the most important body of water on Earth because it carries the world's energy, because it connects its most dynamic growth regions, because 6 choke points that regulate global commerce are embedded within it, and because there is no alternative routing that avoids it at scale. At the geographic center of that ocean sits a nation with a 7,500-kilometer coastline, the 4th largest economy and climbing, a digital financial infrastructure that now processes half of the world's real-time payment transactions, a manufacturing base that the world's largest technology companies are actively building out, a demographic profile that will add a workforce the size of the United States to the global labor pool over the next 20 years, and a naval architecture that is being systematically upgraded to match the strategic weight that all of these factors together demand. For 200 years, colonial architecture suppressed the natural strategic expression of the subcontinent. For the first 7 decades after independence, a combination of institutional friction and policy hesitancy delayed the activation of India's structural advantages. But the activation is no longer a projection. It is a documented, data-verified process underway in real time. The economic mass is present, the strategic doctrine is articulated, the institutional partnerships are operational, The monetary negotiations are live, the naval architecture is being built, and the rest of the world, Washington, Brussels, Riyadh, Tokyo, Canberra, is reorganizing its strategic calculus around the fact of India's rise in ways that would have been unimaginable even 15 years ago. The Indian Ocean does not carry India's name because India claimed it. It carries India's name because geography, history, demography, and economics all arrived at the same structural conclusion independently. At the center of the world's most important ocean sits the world's most important emerging power, and the era in which that power operated below its structural weight is over. The question this analysis leaves you with is not whether India is rising. That question has been answered by the data, by IMF projections, by corporate supply chain decisions, by American strategic doctrine revisions, by European infrastructure investment frameworks, and by the rupee settlement agreements being signed in capital after capital. The question is how you are positioning yourself for the global economy that India is helping to architect. Because this shift is not a future event awaiting confirmation. It is an unfolding present with compounding momentum. In the next report, we go deeper into the specific roadmap of India's financial architecture, how the GIFT City International Financial Hub, the rupee's ascent as a settlement currency, and India's digital public infrastructure stack are constructing the monetary framework of the next global order. That is where the most consequential structural changes are being made.